This cat hissed at everyone at the shelter. Then they found what he was hiding. The fluorescent lights in the back room of Meadowbrook Animal Shelter hummed their constant monotone, a sound that had become as familiar as breathing to anyone who worked there. The November afternoon pressed grey against the windows, the kind of colourless sky that made everything feel heavier, older, more tired. In the far corner, past the rows of kennels where dogs barked and whined for attention, past the intake area where new arrivals trembled in cardboard carriers, there was a single cage that everyone avoided. Thane had been there for 8 months. The volunteers had stopped trying after the first 3. They'd learned to approach his cage sideways, eyes averted, movements slow and apologetic. They'd learned that direct eye contact meant hissing that sounded like air escaping from something punctured and dying. They'd learned that extended hands, no matter how gentle, no matter how laden with treats, would be met with claws that moved faster than thought. The orange and white tabby had become a fixture, as permanent and unwelcoming as the water-stained ceiling tiles above his cage. "He's been here longer than any cat we've ever had," Jennifer, the senior volunteer, had said just last week, her voice carrying that particular tone of defeat that came from caring too much for too long. She stood at a safe distance from the cage, clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. "I don't know what else we can do for him." What no one knew, what no one could have known, was that Thane wasn't guarding territory. He wasn't simply traumatized or feral or broken in the way that some shelter cats were broken. He was protecting something that shouldn't have existed, something that couldn't be explained, something that would change everything the moment it was discovered. Inside the cage, hidden beneath the threadbare blanket that the shelter had provided months ago, something small and fragile breathed in shallow, desperate gulps. Thane positioned himself over the lumpy fabric with military precision, his body a barrier between the hidden treasure and the world that had already taken so much from him. His green eyes, sharp and unforgiving, tracked every movement in the room. His ears swiveled like radar dishes, cataloguing footsteps, voices, the scrape of food bowls against concrete. He hadn't always been like this. 2 years ago, in a different life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely, Thane had been a lap cat. He'd lived with an elderly woman named Dorothy in Portland, Maine, in a house that smelled like lavender and old books. She'd talked to him for hours, her voice soft and unhurried, telling him stories about her late husband, about the garden she could no longer tend, about the way the world had grown stranger and faster and less kind. Thane would curl into the hollow of her lap, purring so hard his whole body vibrated, and for those moments everything made sense. Then one morning she didn't wake up. The silence in that house had been absolute, terrifying in its completeness. Thane had stayed beside her for 2 days, hoping, waiting, not understanding why she wouldn't move, why she wouldn't stroke his head and call him her sweet boy. When the neighbors finally came, when strangers in uniforms filled the house with their loud voices and urgent movements, Thane had fled through an open door into a world that had no patience for lost cats. The streets of Portland had taught him lessons that contradicted everything Dorothy had shown him. They taught him that kindness was rare and usually came with conditions. They taught him that other cats were competitors, not companions. They taught him that humans were unpredictable. Some would leave food, others would throw rocks. Most would simply look through him as if he didn't exist. He'd learned to sleep in drainage pipes, to hunt pigeons in the early morning fog, to make himself small and invisible. Then he'd met Celia. She was a calico stray, lean and scarred, with one ear that had been torn in some long-ago fight. She didn't trust easily either. They'd circled each other for weeks near the dumpsters behind a seafood restaurant, sharing scraps, keeping watch while the other ate. Eventually, they stopped circling. They became a unit, a team, moving through the urban landscape like water-finding paths of least resistance. They'd had almost a year together. One winter morning, Celia had simply been gone. Thane had searched for 3 days, crying in a voice he didn't recognize, checking every alley and doorway and hiding place they'd ever shared. He never found her. He never knew if she'd been hit by a car, or taken to another shelter, or simply decided to move on. The not knowing had been worse than any answer could have been. When animal control had finally trapped him 6 months later, exhausted, underweight, with an infected wound on his shoulder, Thane had given up fighting. He'd let them load him into the van. He'd let them process him at the shelter, let them vaccinate him and treat his wound, and assign him a kennel number. He'd retreated so far inside himself that the shelter workers had labeled him feral, not suitable for adoption within the first week. That had been 8 months ago. 8 months of fluorescent lights and the smell of bleach and the constant cacophony of barking dogs. 8 months of well-meaning volunteers who didn't understand that he wasn't scared, he was grieving. He was protecting himself from ever caring again, from ever being vulnerable enough to lose everything one more time, until 3 weeks ago, when the impossible had happened. The storm had come in fast, the kind of October tempest that turned main streets into rivers and made the whole world sound like it was being torn apart. Thane had heard something in the loading area behind the shelter, a sound so faint he'd almost missed it, beneath the roar of wind and rain, a tiny, desperate mewling. He'd pressed his face against the bars of his cage, straining to hear, every instinct suddenly screaming that something was wrong, something needed help. The shelter had been understaffed that day. The storm had knocked out power in half the county, and most of the volunteers had stayed home. The skeleton crew working hadn't heard the crying. They'd been too busy dealing with leaks in the roof, with anxious dogs, with phone calls from people who'd lost their pets in the chaos. Thane had done something he'd never done before. He'd studied his cage for hours, tested every weld and corner looking for weakness. He'd found it, a spot where the frame had rusted slightly, where the door didn't quite align with the latch. It had taken him most of the afternoon, working when no one was watching, using his weight and his claws and a determination he'd thought was long dead. He'd squeezed through a gap no one would have believed possible, leaving tufts of orange and white fur caught on the metal. The loading area had been dark and cold and full of shadows. The kitten, so small she could fit in the palm of a human hand, had been tucked between 2 boxes of supplies, soaked through, shivering so violently she could barely cry. Thane had known immediately she wouldn't survive the night alone. He'd picked her up by the scruff, the way Celia had once carried kittens she'd found abandoned, and he'd carried her back through the shelter. Getting back into his cage had been harder. The gap seemed smaller from the outside, and he'd been carrying precious cargo, but he'd managed finally, squeezing through with the kitten clutched gently in his mouth. He'd immediately buried her in the blanket, licking her dry, curling his larger body around her tiny form, sharing his warmth. That's when everything had changed. That's when Thane had become the impossible cat, the aggressive cat, the cat who hissed at everyone and everything, because now he had something to lose again. Now he had someone depending on him. And this time he wouldn't fail. He'd started pushing his food through the cage bars that very first night, nudging it toward the hidden kitten. She was too young to eat solid food properly, but she'd lick at the gravy, getting tiny amounts of nutrition. Thane ate almost nothing himself, surviving on whatever minimum he needed to stay functional. His body grew leaner, his eyes grew harder, his hissing grew more vicious. The volunteers assumed his behavior was deteriorating. They whispered about having him evaluated, about whether he was becoming dangerous, about the difficult decisions that sometimes had to be made in shelters with limited resources and unlimited need. Thane heard these whispers. He understood their implications, and he became even more protective, even more aggressive, building walls of fury to hide the secret that slept beneath the blanket. The kitten had survived against impossible odds. After the first few terrifying days, she'd grown stronger. Her breathing had deepened. She'd started moving more, making tiny sounds that Thane would immediately muffle by pressing his body closer, teaching her that silence was safety. He'd learned her rhythms, her needs. He'd become father and mother and guardian all at once. 3 weeks. He'd kept her hidden for 3 weeks. It was a miracle and a testament to the blind spots that existed even in places designed to see everything. The volunteers checked his cage twice daily, but they never looked beneath the blanket. Why would they? He was alone. He'd always been alone. Maris had started working at Meadowbrook Animal Shelter exactly 2 days ago. She was 26, recently certified as a veterinary technician, and carrying grief so fresh it still felt like an open wound. Her father had passed away 13 months ago, a sudden heart attack while he was working on a car in his auto repair shop downtown. One moment he'd been alive, laughing at something on the radio, humming along to a song from the 70s. The next moment he was gone, sprawled on the concrete floor with a wrench still clutched in his hand. Maris had been the one to find him. She'd stopped by the shop after her shift at the veterinary clinic where she'd been interning, planning to surprise him with takeout from his favorite diner. Instead, she'd found silence and stillness, and the terrible understanding that everything had changed in the span of a heartbeat. The month since had been a fog of grief counseling and legal paperwork and the slow, agonizing process of closing down the shop. She'd sold most of the equipment. She'd kept his tools, though, unable to bring herself to let them go. They sat in boxes in her apartment now, smelling faintly of motor oil and possibility. She'd taken the job at Meadowbrook because she needed something new, something that didn't remind her of her father on every corner of every street. The shelter was small, chronically underfunded, staffed mostly by volunteers who cycled through with varying degrees of commitment. But it was work, and work meant purpose, and purpose meant getting through another day without breaking down in the produce section of the grocery store. On her second day, Jennifer had been giving her the full tour, explaining the shelter's procedures and policies with the weary patience of someone who'd given this speech too many times. They'd moved through the dog kennels, past the cat adoption room with its colorful climbing structures and toys, into the back area where the special cases lived. "That's Thane," Jennifer had said, gesturing vaguely toward the corner cage without getting too close. "He's been here 8 months. Extremely aggressive. We're not sure what his story is, but he came in as a stray, pretty beat up. He won't let anyone near him." Maris had approached the cage slowly, professionally, the way she'd been trained. Thane had been sitting in his usual position, body tense, eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She'd noticed immediately that something was off about his posture. He wasn't just defensive. He was positioned deliberately, over a specific spot. "Has anyone checked under his blanket recently?" Maris had asked. Jennifer had frowned. "Why would we? He's alone in there. His body language suggests he's guarding something. He's always like that, guarding his space, I guess." But Maris had seen something in Thane's eyes that went beyond simple territoriality. She'd seen desperation. She'd seen the same look she'd seen in her own mirror for months after her father died, the look of someone holding onto something precious, with a grip that would break bones before it let go. She'd spent the rest of that shift watching the cage from a distance, noting patterns. Thane barely ate. He barely drank. He never moved from his position unless absolutely necessary. And there, just there, when the shelter grew quiet in the late afternoon, she'd heard it, the faintest sound. A tiny mule so soft it could have been imagination, except that Thane's head had snapped down immediately, and he'd shifted his body even more protectively. Now, on this grey November afternoon, with most of the other staff gone for the day, Maris stood in front of Thane's cage with her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd come prepared, thick gloves, a towel, a carrier, and a resolve forged from 13 months of surviving the unsurvivable. "I know," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you're protecting something." Thane's hiss was immediate and vicious, a sound like air escaping from something pressurized and dangerous. His pupils dilated to black pools, his ears flattened completely against his skull. Every muscle in his body coiled tight, ready to spring, ready to fight, ready to die if necessary to protect what was his. "I'm not going to hurt you," Maris continued, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "I'm not going to take anything away, but whatever's under that blanket needs help. You know it does. That's why you're so scared." She'd seen this before in her internship, the mother cat who'd hidden her sick kitten in a closet, attacking anyone who tried to approach, the dog who'd guarded his injured littermate with such ferocity they'd needed sedation just to examine them. Love made animals dangerous in ways that fear never could. Thane watched her with those unforgiving green eyes, his entire being radiating refusal. His claws extended, scraping against the metal floor of the cage with a sound that set teeth on edge. He positioned himself even more firmly over the blanket, making himself as large as possible, a living barrier between threat and treasure. "My father died last year," Maris said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I wasn't there. I mean, I was, but too late. I found him, but I couldn't help him. And for months all I could think about was how I'd failed, how I should have been there sooner, how I should have known somehow." Thane's hissing faltered, just slightly. His eyes remained locked on her face. "You're trying to protect something you love," Maris continued, her voice thick with emotions she usually kept locked away. "I understand that. I understand being so scared of losing someone that you'd fight the whole world to keep them safe. But sometimes," her voice cracked, "sometimes we can't do it alone. Sometimes holding on too tight is what hurts them most." She moved closer to the cage, slowly telegraphing every movement. Thane's body tensed further, a live wire of panic and determination. She could see his muscles quivering with the strain of holding back, of wanting to attack, but also desperately needing her to understand. "I'm going to open this cage," Maris said. "I'm going to look under that blanket. And if there's something there that needs help, I'm going to help it. That doesn't mean I'm taking anything away from you. It means I'm trying to save what you love." Her hand reached for the latch. Thane's growl deepened, became something primal and terrifying. But beneath the growl, so faint she almost missed it, came another sound. A tiny, wavering mewl. The sound of something impossibly small and impossibly vulnerable. Maris opened the cage door. Everything happened in heartbeats. Thane lunged forward, but not to attack, to block. He threw himself between Maris and the blanket, his body spread wide, his teeth bared in a display that was pure protective desperation. Maris moved the towel in her hands, creating a barrier, buying herself seconds. She reached past Thane's thrashing form, grabbed the edge of the blanket, and pulled. There, curled in a nest of orange and white fur that Thane had pulled from his own body, was a calico kitten. She couldn't have been more than 4 weeks old. Her eyes were barely open, cloudy with the film of early infancy. She was thin, desperately, dangerously thin, but alive. Against all odds, all logic, all reason, she was alive. Maris felt her breath catch in her throat. Oh my God! Thane's aggression evaporated in an instant, replaced by something worse. He made a sound Maris had never heard a cat make before. A low, keening cry that sounded like grief and fear and love all twisted together. He tried to climb over her to get back to the kitten, his claws catching on her scrubs, his movements frantic but no longer violent. "It's okay," Maris whispered, her hands shaking as she gently lifted the kitten. The tiny creature was so light, so fragile, like holding a handful of dandelion seeds. "It's okay. I've got her. I've got her." Thane froze, his green eyes locked on the kitten in Maris's hands. His whole body trembled. His mouth opened in another of those heartbreaking cries. "I'm not taking her away," Maris said firmly, lowering the kitten back into the cage, but positioning herself so she could examine her properly. "See, she's right here, she's safe, but she needs help. And you know it. You've been doing everything you can, but she needs more." The kitten mewled weakly, and Thane immediately moved to her, sniffing her frantically, licking her face with rough, desperate strokes. Maris watched, her professional assessment at war with the emotion clogging her throat. The kitten was dehydrated, malnourished, and based on the slight blue tinge to her gums, possibly had a heart condition. She wouldn't survive much longer without intervention. "How long have you had her?" Maris murmured, though of course Thane couldn't answer. But looking at his thinned body, at the worn patches in his coat where he'd pulled fur for the kitten's nest, at the fierce desperation in his eyes, she could guess. Weeks. He'd kept her hidden for weeks, sacrificing his own health, his own safety, everything to keep her alive. Maris sat back on her heels, her mind racing through options and protocols and the complicated reality of shelter politics. Technically, she should report this immediately. There were procedures for found kittens, especially ones this young and vulnerable, but she could already imagine how it would play out. The kitten would be separated from Thane. She'd be put in the nursery, bottle-fed by volunteers, given medical care, and Thane would be alone again, having lost the thing he'd fought so hard to protect. "We're going to do this differently," Maris said, more to herself than to Thane. "We're going to break some rules." Thane watched her with those unforgiving eyes, his body still positioned protectively over the kitten. He didn't understand her words, but he understood intention. He understood threat versus safety. And something in Maris's voice, in her careful movements, in the tears she wasn't quite hiding, made him pause. "I'm going to help her," Maris said, meeting Thane's gaze directly. "But I'm not going to take her away from you. Do you understand? We're going to do this together." She spent the next hour working carefully, methodically, keeping her movements slow and predictable. She brought specialized kitten formula, warmed to exactly the right temperature. She brought a heating pad, clean towels, and a smaller carrier that could fit inside Thane's cage. She brought medical supplies, everything she'd need to assess the kitten's condition without removing her from Thane's presence. The orange and white tabby watched every movement with laser focus, his body never fully relaxing, but gradually losing some of its desperate tension. When Maris carefully bottle-fed the kitten, Thane pressed close, sniffing the formula, monitoring every swallow. When Maris examined the kitten's tiny chest with her stethoscope, listening to the irregular flutter of her heartbeat, Thane placed one paw gently on Maris's arm. Not aggressive, just present, a reminder that he was there and watching. "Her heart," Maris murmured, her professional concern deepening. "It's not right. She's going to need to see the vet. Real examination, maybe medication." Thane made a low sound in his chest, almost like a question. "But not tonight," Maris added quickly. "Tonight we just get her stronger. Make sure she can eat, that she's warm enough. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest." She worked until the shelter closed, until the other volunteers had left and the building settled into its nighttime quiet. She set up the heating pad inside Thane's cage, positioned the kitten on it with fresh towels, left extra formula and supplies where she could access them easily. Thane immediately curled himself around the kitten, his larger body a living fortress, but he didn't hiss when Maris reached in one last time to adjust the heating pad's temperature. "You saved her," Maris said quietly. "Against impossible odds, you kept her alive. That takes a kind of love that most creatures never find." Thane looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Meadowbrook, she saw something other than aggression in his eyes. She saw exhaustion. She saw fear. She saw the same desperate hope she'd carried for 13 months, the hope that somehow, despite everything, the things we love might survive. "I'll be back first thing tomorrow," Maris promised, "and I swear to you, I'm not going to let anyone separate you. Whatever happens, you stay together." As she walked out of the shelter into the cold November night, Maris realized she'd made a promise she had no idea how to keep. The shelter had rules. There were protocols for aggressive cats, for underage kittens, for situations that didn't fit neatly into procedures designed for normal circumstances. And nothing about Thane and his hidden kitten was normal. But as she drove home through streets that still smelled like her father's absence, past the closed auto shop with its darkened windows, she thought about love and protection and the lengths we go to keep our promises to those who can't speak for themselves. She thought about how grief had taught her that rules were sometimes less important than doing what was right, even when right was complicated and messy and impossible to justify on paper. Tomorrow, everything would get more difficult. Tomorrow, they'd have to face the reality of a sick kitten and a protective cat, and a shelter system that wasn't designed for stories like theirs. But tonight, in that back room under the fluorescent lights, something impossible was happening. A traumatized cat was learning to trust again. A dying kitten was getting stronger, and a woman who'd spent 13 months feeling helpless was finally able to help someone. In the darkness of the shelter, Thane pressed his nose against the tiny calico's head, breathing in her scent, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. For the first time in 3 weeks, he allowed himself to close his eyes. Not fully, never fully, but enough to rest. Because for the first time since he'd found her shivering in the loading area, he wasn't completely alone in keeping her safe. Morning would bring new challenges, new fears, new battles to fight. But morning was still hours away. For now there was warmth and milk scent, and the soft, steady breathing of someone who depended on him. For now that was enough. Before we continue with the story, if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. Give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support truly helps keep this channel alive and growing. Maris arrived at Meadowbrook Animal Shelter 40 minutes before her shift officially started, carrying a canvas bag stuffed with supplies she'd purchased from her own rapidly dwindling savings. Specialized kitten formula, extra bottles with soft nipples designed for newborns, electrolyte supplements, a digital thermometer small enough for tiny bodies, and a book on feline cardiac conditions she'd stayed up half the night reading. The November morning was bitter cold, frost crystallizing on car windshields and making the whole world look fragile and temporary. The shelter was still mostly dark when she unlocked the back door, the security system beeping its warning before she punched in her code. The familiar smell hit her immediately, that particular combination of cleaning products and animal bodies and institutional efficiency that all shelters shared. The dogs in the front kennels stirred at the sound of her entrance, a few barking hopefully. Thinking it might be feeding time, Maris moved quickly through the main room, past the cat adoption area with its empty climbing trees and silent toys, into the back room where Thane's cage sat in its usual corner. Her heart hammered as she approached, afraid of what she might find. Had the kitten survived the night? Had Thane's trust from yesterday evaporated with the darkness? But as she rounded the corner, she stopped short. Thane was awake, alert, his green eyes tracking her movement, but he wasn't hissing. He was positioned over the kitten as always, protective but not aggressive. And the kitten, the tiny calico, was moving, squirming slightly, making soft sounds that were stronger than yesterday's weak mewls. "Good morning," Maris said softly, setting her bag down carefully. "How's our girl?" Thane watched her warily, but didn't growl when she approached the cage. She could see the subtle changes in his posture from yesterday. Less panic, more calculation. He was assessing her, measuring her intentions against her actions from the previous night. She'd promised not to separate them, and she'd kept that promise. That meant something in the complex mathematics of feline trust. Maris spent the next 20 minutes working carefully, feeding the kitten small amounts of formula, checking her temperature, listening to her heart. The irregular rhythm was still there, that flutter-skip-pause pattern that made Maris's professional instincts scream warnings. The kitten needed to see Soren, the veterinarian who visited the shelter twice a month, but Soren wasn't scheduled to come for another week, and a week might be too long. "We need to get her examined," Maris murmured, more to herself than to Thane. "Properly examined. X-rays, blood work, the whole thing." The orange and white tabby made a low sound in his chest. Not quite a growl, but close. His paw moved protectively over the kitten's small body. "I know," Maris said. "I know you don't want her going anywhere. But her heart—" She paused, searching for words that couldn't possibly translate across the species barrier, but needing to say them anyway. "Her heart isn't working right. Without treatment, she won't make it. You've kept her alive this long, but now we need more than just warmth and food." The shelter's morning routine began filtering in around them. Jennifer arrived, followed by 2 morning volunteers, their voices carrying from the front room as they started preparing breakfast for the animals. Maris heard them talking, laughing about something, the normalcy of their conversation strange against the weight of what she was dealing with in the back room. "Maris!" Jennifer's voice called out. "You here early?" "Yeah," Maris called back, her eyes never leaving Thane. "Just checking on some things." Jennifer appeared in the doorway, coffee cup in hand, her expression curious. "Everything okay?" Maris made a split-second decision. "Actually, I need to talk to you about Thane." Jennifer's expression shifted to concern as she approached, though she still kept her distance from the cage. "Is he doing worse?" "I was afraid of that. He's been so aggressive, and I know that sometimes when cats have been in shelter situations this long without improvement, he's been hiding a kitten," Maris said flatly. Jennifer's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "What?" "Under his blanket. For weeks, based on his condition. A calico, about 4 weeks old, severely malnourished and with what I'm pretty sure is a congenital heart condition." Jennifer's coffee cup lowered slowly. She stared at the cage, at Thane's protective posture, at the small lump visible now beneath the orange and white fur. "How is that even possible? We check these cages twice a day." He hid her, deliberately. Every time someone approached, he became aggressive to keep them from looking too closely. He's been giving her his food, keeping her warm with his own body heat. "My God." Jennifer moved closer, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine shock. "Can I see her?" Maris positioned herself carefully, ready to intervene if necessary. But when Jennifer knelt beside the cage, peering inside, Thane's reaction was measured rather than explosive. He hissed once, a warning, but didn't lunge. He was learning, Maris realized. Learning that not all humans were threats, that some might actually help. The tiny calico chose that moment to mewl, a sound that was part protest, part demand. Jennifer's expression melted into something soft and sad. "She's so small. And sick," Maris added. "She needs immediate veterinary care. Real care. Not just what I can do here with basic supplies." Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, her mind clearly working through the implications and complications. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "We have procedures for situations like this. I know the procedures. The kitten goes to our medical nursery. She gets evaluated, treated, put on a bottle feeding schedule with trained volunteers. And Thane—" Jennifer paused, her discomfort visible. "Thane goes back to being a regular adoption candidate once we figure out what to do about his aggression issues." "No." The word came out harder than Maris intended. Jennifer's eyebrows rose. "Maris, I understand this is emotional, but we have to think practically. That kitten needs 24-hour care. She needs medication that we can't administer if she's in a cage with an aggressive cat. And Thane, his behavior has been consistently dangerous. We've been patient, but 8 months is our longest hold ever. He's not aggressive. He's protective. There's a difference. That's a semantic distinction that doesn't matter if someone gets hurt. Maris felt her jaw tighten, felt the familiar anger that came from watching people make practical decisions that ignored the messy reality of love and loss. You're wrong. It matters completely. He's been taking care of her for weeks. He's kept her alive when she should have died. Separating them now would be, she struggled for the right word, cruel. It would be following protocol, Jennifer said, but her voice lacked conviction. Maris, you've been here 2 days. I understand you're passionate, but you don't know how complicated these situations can get. We have limited resources, limited space, limited funding. We can't make every decision based on emotions. What's the point of saving animals if we break them in the process? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Jennifer looked at the cage again, at Thane's fierce green eyes and protective posture, at the tiny life he'd fought so hard to preserve. Her expression wavered. "Let me talk to Kellen," she said finally. "He's the director. This is his decision, not mine." "When will he be in?" "This afternoon, 2 o'clock. Maris nodded, already planning. "Can we keep this quiet until then? Just between us?" Jennifer hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and compassion. "If anyone asks about Thane, I have to tell them the truth. I'm not asking you to lie. Just don't volunteer information. Give me until 2 o'clock to figure out a plan." After a long moment, Jennifer nodded. 2 o'clock, but Maris, don't get your hopes up. Kellen's practical, he has to be. We're already over capacity and under budget. Adding a sick kitten who needs expensive medical care isn't going to be an easy sell. After Jennifer left, Maris spent the next hour researching. She called every veterinary clinic in the area, asking about costs for cardiac workups in kittens. The numbers made her stomach hurt. Even a basic echocardiogram would run several $100s, not including blood work, x-rays, or potential medication. If the kitten needed surgery, and based on what Maris could hear through her stethoscope, surgery was a real possibility, the costs would climb into the thousands. The shelter's medical budget was already stretched thin. Maris had heard Jennifer and the other volunteers talking about it, about how they had to make impossible choices every day, about which animals could receive extensive care and which couldn't. A kitten with a heart condition, especially one hidden away by an aggressive cat, would be easy to justify as too expensive, too complicated, too risky, unless Maris could find another way. She thought about her father's shop, still sitting empty downtown. She'd been avoiding dealing with it, avoiding the painful process of selling the property, but the real estate agent had been optimistic about the value. Small-town auto shops on main streets were apparently in demand. The money from that sale could cover the kitten's medical expenses, could cover a lot of medical expenses for a lot of animals. But selling meant letting go of the last physical piece of her father's presence. It meant admitting that he was really gone, that the shop where he'd spent 40 years of his life would belong to someone else, would become something different. It meant closing a door she'd been holding open through sheer force of will. Maris looked at the cage, at Thane curled protectively around the tiny calico, at the fierce devotion in every line of his body. She thought about what it meant to love something enough to sacrifice everything, to fight impossible odds, to refuse to give up even when the world said to let go. "I need to make some calls," she told Thane quietly, "but I'm not giving up on you two. I promise." The morning passed in a blur of routine tasks, feeding animals, cleaning kennels, processing paperwork for adoptions. But Maris's mind was elsewhere, calculating costs and options and strategies. She made more phone calls during her lunch break, talked to the real estate agent about accelerating the sale of her father's shop, contacted a lawyer about setting up some kind of medical fund. At 1:45, Kellen Brennan arrived at the shelter. He was in his early 40s, tall and thin, with prematurely grey hair and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too many sad endings. He'd been running Meadowbrook for 6 years, navigating the constant crisis of too many animals and too few resources. Jennifer met him in his office, and through the thin walls, Maris could hear the murmur of their conversation. She positioned herself in the back room near Thane's cage, waiting. The kitten was sleeping, exhausted from her morning feeding. Thane was awake, alert, his ears swiveling toward the sounds from Kellen's office. Animals always knew when something important was happening, when the humans were making decisions that would affect their lives. At exactly 2 o'clock, Kellen and Jennifer emerged from the office and headed toward the back room. Maris stood up straighter, her heart pounding, her arguments lined up and ready to deploy. Kellen stopped a few feet from the cage, studying the scene. His expression was carefully neutral, professional. "Jennifer told me what you found." 3 weeks, Maris said. "He's been keeping her alive for 3 weeks, maybe longer, against impossible odds. And she's sick. She has a heart condition, but it might be treatable." "Might be." Kellen crouched down, getting a better view of the cage. Thane's body tensed immediately, his hiss sharp and warning. Kellen didn't flinch, and he's been consistently aggressive since he arrived. 8 months of aggressive behavior. Because he was protecting her, because he was terrified someone would take her away. Kellen was quiet for a moment, his eyes moving between Thane and the kitten. "You've been here 2 days, Maris. You don't know the history of this shelter, the decisions we've had to make. Last year, we had to euthanize 12 cats because we didn't have space or funding for medical treatment. 12. Do you know what that does to the people who work here? Do you know what it does to me?" The pain in his voice was raw and real. Maris felt her anger deflate slightly, replaced by understanding. "I'm not trying to make this harder, but you are. Because now I have to decide whether to spend resources we don't have on a kitten who might not survive anyway, while also dealing with a cat who's shown he can be dangerous." "He's not dangerous. He's devoted. Those can look identical from the outside." Kellen stood up, his expression weary. "Here's what I can offer. We separate them. Carefully, professionally. The kitten goes to medical foster, gets proper care. Thane stays here and we work on his behavior issues. If he improves, if he shows he can be safe around people, we consider adoption. If not..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the air. "That's not good enough," Maris said. "It's what I can do with the resources available." "Then we get more resources." Maris pulled out her phone, showing him the emails she'd been exchanging all morning. "I'm selling my father's property, an auto shop downtown. The real estate agent thinks we can close in 6 weeks, maybe less. The estimated value is enough to cover the kitten's medical expenses and then some. We could set up a fund, help other animals with expensive conditions." Kellen's expression shifted. Surprise and something else. Hope, maybe. Or the memory of hope from before this job had worn it away. "That's generous. But 6 weeks? The kitten can survive 6 weeks with basic care. I'll provide it personally, around the clock if necessary. And we keep her with Thane, we let them stay together. Maris..." "He saved her life." The words came out fierce, desperate. "Against impossible odds, with no help, no resources, nothing but his own love and determination. He saved her life. And now we're going to tear them apart because it's too complicated? Because it doesn't fit our procedures?" Jennifer, who'd been silent until now, spoke up quietly. "She has a point, Kellen. I've never seen anything like this. The way he's protected her, sacrificed for her, it's extraordinary." Kellen rubbed his face with both hands. The gesture of a man carrying too much weight. "If she doesn't make it, if the kitten dies despite our efforts, what then?" "Then at least we tried," Maris said. "Then at least we showed Thane that humans can be trusted, that not everyone takes things away. Maybe he'll be adoptable then. Maybe he'll have a chance. And if the medical costs exceed what you can provide, then I'll figure something else out, crowdfunding, fundraisers, whatever it takes." The silence stretched out, filled with the ambient sounds of the shelter. Dogs barking, cats meowing, the hum of fluorescent lights and heating systems. Thane watched them all with his unforgiving green eyes, understanding nothing of their words, but everything about their intentions. His body remained curved protectively around the kitten, a living shield, a promise made flesh. Finally, Kellen sighed. 6 weeks. The kitten stays with Thane, but only if you take personal responsibility for her care. Round-the-clock feeding schedule, medication, monitoring. Any sign of deterioration, we reassess immediately, and you need to work on Thane's socialization. He has to show improvement, has to prove he can be safe. Relief flooded through Maris so strongly, her knees felt weak. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This could still end badly." Kellen's expression was grim, but Jennifer's right. If we can't make exceptions for something this extraordinary, what's the point of any of this? After Kellen left, Jennifer touched Maris's arm gently. That was brave, and maybe a little crazy. Probably more crazy than brave, Maris admitted. Your father's shop, that's a big sacrifice. It's just a building, Maris said, though her voice cracked slightly on the words. He's gone, but she's alive, and maybe that's the point. Maybe the best way to honor the people we've lost is to fight like hell for the ones who still have a chance. Jennifer nodded slowly. I'll help however I can, with the fundraising, with Thane's socialization, whatever you need. After Jennifer left, Maris approached the cage again. She opened it slowly, carefully, and Thane didn't hiss. She reached inside and gently stroked the kitten's tiny head with one finger. The calico made a soft sound. Content, safe. We did it, Maris whispered. Phase 1 complete. Now we just have to keep our promises. Thane watched her, and for the first time since they'd met, he leaned slightly into her touch when she ran her hand along his back. Just slightly, just enough. A beginning. That night, Maris stayed late again, setting up a more elaborate care system inside Thane's cage. She brought a better heating pad, more sophisticated feeding supplies, a journal to track the kitten's weight and vital signs. She named the tiny calico Coralie after her grandmother, a strong woman who'd survived her own share of impossibilities. Coralie, she repeated softly, and the kitten's ear twitched at the sound. Your name is Coralie, and you're going to survive, because you've already beaten odds that should have killed you, because Thane refused to let you die, and because I'm not going to let his sacrifice be for nothing. Thane curled around Coralie, his purr starting up like an engine that had been silent for months. The sound filled the small space, vibrating through the metal cage and into the larger room. It was the sound of hope, fragile and fierce, refusing to be extinguished. Maris drove home that night with tears streaming down her face, crying for her father and for the shop she was going to sell, crying for a broken cat and a dying kitten, crying for all the love in the world that fought impossible odds, and sometimes, against all logic, won. The next morning brought the first real test. Coralie needed medication, and getting pills into a 4-week-old kitten was complicated even under ideal circumstances. Getting pills into a 4-week-old kitten while her protective guardian watched with laser focus was exponentially harder. Maris arrived early again, prepared with pill pockets designed for tiny mouths and an elaborate plan for distraction. But when she approached the cage, she found Thane already awake, watching her with something that wasn't quite trust, but wasn't hostility either. It was expectation. He'd learned over the past 2 days that Maris brought help, not harm, that her presence meant Coralie getting stronger. Okay, Maris said softly, opening the cage. We're adding medication today. It's going to taste bad, and Coralie's not going to like it, but it'll help her heart. She'd broken the tiny pill into quarters, mixing it with a small amount of wet kitten food that she'd warmed slightly. Coralie, stronger now after regular feedings, was awake and alert. Her eyes, still that cloudy blue of early kittenhood, tracked movement with increasing focus. When Maris offered the medicated food on the tip of her finger, Coralie licked at it tentatively. Then her face scrunched up in obvious disgust, and she pulled back, shaking her head. Thane immediately moved closer, sniffing the food, his expression suspicious. I know, Maris said. It tastes terrible, but you need it, little one. She tried again, using a different approach, mixing the medication with formula, making it sweeter. This time Coralie took more, though she protested with tiny mules between swallows. Thane watched the entire process, his body tense, ready to intervene if necessary. But when Coralie finished the medicated formula and immediately curled back into Thane's warmth, seeming no worse for the experience, his tension eased. See, Maris said to Thane, I'm helping. We're on the same team. Over the next week, a routine developed. Maris arrived before her shift started and stayed after it ended, spending hours in the back room with Thane and Coralie. She fed Coralie 6 times a day, administered medication, tracked every ounce of weight gain, every improvement in heart rhythm. She talked constantly, telling them stories about her father, about the cars he'd fixed, about the time he'd rescued a stray dog and kept it in the shop for 3 months before finally admitting he'd become attached and taking it home. And slowly, incrementally, Thane began to change. He stopped hissing when Maris approached. He allowed her to touch him, to run her hands over his thin body, checking for injuries or illness. He ate more, gaining back some of the weight he'd lost during his weeks of sacrifice. Most remarkably, he began to trust. It started small. On the fourth day, when Maris was feeding Coralie, Thane placed his head on her knee, just for a moment, just testing, but the gesture spoke volumes. On the sixth day, when a new volunteer accidentally knocked over a mop near the cage, Thane looked to Maris first before reacting, seeking reassurance from her expression before deciding how much danger the sound represented. Jennifer noticed the changes. "I've never seen anything like it," she said one afternoon, watching Maris work with the pair. "He's like a different cat." "He's the same cat," Maris corrected. "We're just seeing who he actually is, instead of who fear made him pretend to be." But not everyone was convinced. On the eighth day, Soren made his monthly visit to the shelter. He was in his 50s, weathered and competent, with decades of experience treating shelter animals. When Jennifer briefed him on Thane and Coralie's situation, his expression grew increasingly skeptical. "Let me see this kitten," he said, his tone professional but doubtful. Maris felt her stomach tighten as she led him to the back room. Thane's reaction to Soren was immediate and visceral. His body went rigid, his pupils dilated, and a low growl started deep in his chest. It was the most aggressive Maris had seen him in days, and she understood why immediately. Soren smelled like other animals, like medical procedures, like the kind of clinical efficiency that cats instinctively feared. "Thane, it's okay," Maris said quickly, positioning herself between Soren and the cage. "He's here to help Coralie." But Thane wasn't listening. His focus was entirely on Soren, and every line of his body screamed refusal. When Soren reached toward the cage, Thane lunged at the bars, slamming against them with such force that the entire structure shook. His hiss was pure fury, and his claws extended fully, scraping at the metal. Soren pulled back, his expression grim. "That cat is dangerous." "He's protective," Maris corrected, her voice tight. "He doesn't know you. He doesn't trust you. I need to examine the kitten. I can't do that with him acting like this. Give me a minute." Maris moved closer to the cage, ignoring the way her hands shook. "Thane, listen to me. Soren needs to check on Coralie. He's a doctor, like me, but better. He can tell us what's wrong with her heart, how to fix it, but you have to let him get close." Thane's growl didn't stop, but his eyes flicked to her face, to the expression she wore. She'd never lied to him, never pretended things were okay when they weren't. He'd learned to read her, to trust her fear versus her calm. "I'm not going to let anything bad happen," Maris continued. "But we need help, real help, the kind I can't give on my own." She reached into the cage slowly, telegraphing every movement. Thane's body remained tense, but he didn't strike when her hand touched his back. She stroked him gently, rhythmically, speaking in that low, constant tone she'd developed over their time together. "Soren's going to look at Coralie. He's going to touch her, maybe take her out of the cage for a minute. It's going to feel scary, but it's necessary. And I'll be right here the whole time. I promise." After several long minutes, Thane's growl subsided to a low rumble. His body remained coiled tight, ready to spring, but he allowed Maris to carefully lift Coralie from the nest of blankets. The tiny calico protested immediately, mewling for Thane, and his response was heartbreaking, a sharp, desperate cry that sounded like his world was ending. "Quick," Maris said to Soren, "do your examination quickly." Soren worked with the efficient precision of long experience. He listened to Coralie's heart, palpated her tiny body, checked her gums and eyes and ears. The entire process took less than 3 minutes, but to Thane, it must have felt like hours. He paced frantically in the small cage, crying continuously, his eyes never leaving Coralie. "Put her back," Soren said finally. Maris immediately returned Coralie to the cage, and Thane was on her instantly, sniffing her all over, licking her face, checking for damage or distress. Coralie burrowed into his warmth, her protests subsiding to soft mewls. "Well?" Maris asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Soren's expression was serious. "She has a heart murmur, grade 3, possibly grade 4. Based on what I'm hearing, I'd guess a congenital defect. Probably a patent ductus arteriosus or possibly a ventricular septal defect." The medical terms hung heavy in the air. Maris had read enough to know what they meant. "Can it be treated?" "Possibly. She'd need an echocardiogram to confirm the diagnosis, then we'd know what we're dealing with. Some defects close on their own as the kitten grows. Others require surgery." "And if it requires surgery?" You're looking at several $1,000s plus post-operative care, medication for life, potentially. Jennifer, who'd been listening from the doorway, made a small sound. Kellen's going to have a heart attack of his own. The good news, Soren continued, is that she's gained weight. Her color is better than I'd expect. Someone's been taking excellent care of her. He glanced at the cage, at Thane still curled protectively around Coralie. Both someone's, apparently. What's our timeline? Maris asked. She needs that echocardiogram within the next 2 weeks. Sooner would be better. Until we know exactly what we're dealing with, she's at risk for sudden decompensation. Heart failure, basically. After Soren left with instructions and a prescription for a different, stronger cardiac medication, Maris sank down onto the floor beside the cage. Her mind raced through calculations, the cost of an echocardiogram, the potential cost of surgery, the timeline for selling her father's shop. 6 weeks, the real estate agent had said, but Coralie might not have 6 weeks. I need to make some calls, she said to no one in particular. That evening, sitting in her apartment surrounded by her father's tools still in their boxes, Maris made decisions that would change everything. She called the real estate agent and asked about accelerating the sale even if it meant accepting a lower offer. She researched crowdfunding platforms, starting to draft a campaign that told Thane and Coralie's story. She called her aunt, her father's sister who lived 2 states away, and asked about borrowing money against her inheritance. Her aunt listened to the whole story, then was quiet for a long moment. Your father would have done the same thing, she said finally. He always cared more about what was right than what was practical. Drove your mother crazy. I know it sounds insane, Maris said. A month ago, I didn't know these animals existed, and now I'm potentially bankrupting myself for them. That's not insane. That's love. Love always looks crazy from the outside. Her aunt paused. I can lend you 3,000. It's not much, but it's what I have liquid right now. Maris felt tears burning her eyes. I'll pay you back. I know you will. And Maris, your father would be proud. Not of the financial decision necessarily, but of the heart behind it. That's what mattered to him. Always. 2 days later, Maris had raised enough through loans and promises and her own depleted savings to cover the echocardiogram and have a small buffer for whatever came next. She scheduled the appointment at the best veterinary cardiac specialist within driving distance, a 3-hour trip to a clinic in Burlington. The problem was Thane. There was no way to take Coralie for the procedure without him, and transporting a still aggressive cat and a critically ill kitten for 6 hours round trip presented its own set of challenges. But Maris had learned over the past 2 weeks that Thane's aggression was contextual. With her in his familiar space, he was gentle. With Coralie, he was tender. It was only when strangers approached, when his control over the situation slipped, that he became dangerous. We'll need a big carrier, Jennifer said when Maris explained her plan. Big enough for both of them. And padding, lots of padding. Coralie can't handle much jostling. I'll come with you, Jennifer offered. Extra pair of hands, just in case. The day of the trip arrived cold and clear, early December turning Vermont into a postcard of itself. White fields, dark evergreens, ice crystallizing on bare branches. Maris arrived at the shelter at dawn, her car already loaded with supplies. She'd barely slept, running through every possible disaster scenario, every way this could go catastrophically wrong. Getting Thane and Coralie into the large carrier took 20 minutes of patient coaxing. Thane was suspicious of the unfamiliar crate, resistant to leaving his known space. But when Maris placed Coralie inside first, settled her on a heated pad surrounded by familiar-smelling blankets, Thane's resistance crumbled. He couldn't leave her. His whole being oriented around her safety, and if she was in the carrier, that's where he needed to be. The drive to Burlington was tense. Thane cried for the first 30 minutes, a continuous low wailing that spoke of confusion and fear. Coralie, sedated slightly with medication Soren had prescribed, slept through most of it. Maris drove carefully, avoiding sudden movements, taking curves slowly, while Jennifer sat in the back seat monitoring the carrier, talking to Thane in a continuous soothing stream. Almost there, Jennifer kept saying. You're doing so good. Both of you are doing so good. The veterinary cardiac clinic was state-of-the-art, all gleaming equipment and efficient staff. The cardiologist, Dr. Patricia Hammond, was in her 40s, with kind eyes and the calm competence of someone who'd seen every variation of animal heart condition imaginable. She listened to Maris explain Thane and Coralie's story without interruption, her expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Hammond said finally. "I've heard of queens nursing abandoned kittens, but never a male cat adopting and caring for an infant like this." "He saved her life," Maris said simply. "And now we'll do our best to give her a real chance at living it." Dr. Hammond looked at the carrier, at Thane's fierce green eyes watching through the mesh. "Getting her away from him for the procedure is going to be challenging." "I know. I can sedate him. It'll be easier, safer for everyone." Maris hesitated, thinking about trust, about the fragile bridge she'd built with Thane over the past 2 weeks. Sedating him meant taking away his control, his ability to protect. It meant violating the trust they'd established, but it also meant Coralie could get the care she needed without Thane suffering through hours of panicked separation. "Okay," Maris said finally, "but I stay with him until he's out, and I'm there when he wakes up." The sedation process was gentle but still heartbreaking. Thane fought the injection, hissing and scratching, but Maris held him carefully, talking to him constantly, promising him this was temporary, that Coralie would be safe, that he'd wake up, and she'd still be there. His eyes, growing unfocused, fixed on her face with an expression that looked like betrayal. Then they closed, and his body went limp in her arms. "I'm sorry," Maris whispered, stroking his orange and white fur. "I'm so sorry, but this is how we save her." The echocardiogram took 90 minutes. Maris and Jennifer waited in a small room, drinking terrible coffee and not talking much. The silence felt appropriate, heavy with hope and fear in equal measure. Through the walls, they could occasionally hear the sounds of the clinic, other animals, other families, other stories of love and desperation. Finally, Dr. Hammond emerged, her expression carefully neutral. "Let's talk in my office." The office was warm, filled with photos of pets she'd treated, thank you cards from grateful owners. Dr. Hammond pulled up images on her computer, swirling black and white patterns that meant nothing to Maris's untrained eye. "Coralie has a patent ductus arteriosus," Dr. Hammond said. "It's a congenital defect where a blood vessel that should close after birth remains open. It's causing her heart to work much harder than it should, and over time it'll lead to heart failure. Can it be fixed?" "Yes, with surgery. We'd go in and close the ductus. It's a relatively standard procedure, though complicated by her size and age." "Survival rate?" "In kittens this young, about 70% with a skilled surgeon. The risks are primarily related to anesthesia and her small size." 70%. Not certainty, but not hopelessness either. "Cost?" $4,000 for the surgery itself, another $1,000 for post-operative care and monitoring. "That's our standard rate, though we do have a payment plan option. $5,000. Added to the echocardiogram, Maris was looking at close to $6,000 total, most of her available funds, eating into the loans she'd secured, leaving almost nothing for emergencies. "How soon does she need the surgery?" "Within the next month. Sooner would be better. Her heart is already showing signs of strain." Maris looked at the echocardiogram images, at the visual proof of Coralie's damaged heart, fighting to keep her tiny body alive. She thought about Thane, sedated in the next room, who'd given up everything to keep this kitten breathing. She thought about her father, who'd always said that the most important things in life couldn't be measured in money. "Schedule it," Maris said, "as soon as possible." Dr. Hammond nodded slowly. "I'll check my schedule. We might be able to fit her in next week if we have a cancellation. And in the meantime, medication, careful monitoring, and honestly, keep doing what you're doing. She's alive because someone refused to let her die. That kind of devotion is powerful medicine on its own." When Thane woke up from sedation, Coralie was tucked against his side, and Maris's hand was resting gently on his head. His eyes opened slowly, confused and unfocused. Then he saw Coralie, did a frantic check to ensure she was breathing and whole and safe, and relaxed back into Maris's touch with a rumbling purr that sounded like relief. "See?" Maris whispered. "I kept my promise. She's safe. You're both safe." The drive back to Meadowbrook was quieter. Thane, still groggy from sedation, dozed with his body curved around Coralie. The December landscape passed outside the windows, fields going grey with approaching dusk, lights beginning to glow in farmhouse windows. It felt like returning from battle, exhausted but not defeated. "What you're doing," Jennifer said quietly from the back seat, "it's going to save their lives." "Maybe," Maris said. 70% chance. Better than the 0% they had before you found them. That night, back at the shelter, Maris set up a more elaborate monitoring system in Thane's cage. A baby monitor so she could hear if Coralie had breathing difficulties overnight. A detailed medication schedule taped to the wall. Emergency contact numbers, including Dr. Hammond's direct line. Thane watched her work, his eyes clearer now, the sedation fully worn off. When she finished and sat down beside the cage, he did something he'd never done before. He reached one orange paw through the bars and rested it on her hand. The gesture was tentative but deliberate. A thank you, an acknowledgement, a bond. "We're going to get through this," Maris told him. "All of us together. Your job is to keep loving her. My job is to make sure that love has a chance to mean something." She drove home that night, thinking about percentages and possibilities, about the mathematics of hope. 70% meant 3 in 10 didn't survive, but it also meant 7 in 10 did. And sometimes, when you loved something enough, you bet everything on being in that 70%. The next week passed in a strange, suspended tension, everyone at the shelter waiting for Dr. Hammond's call about a surgery slot. Coralie continued to grow stronger on her medications, gaining ounces, becoming more active. Thane continued his transformation, growing gentler with each passing day, allowing more volunteers to approach, though he remained most relaxed with Maris. Kellen stopped by the back room one afternoon, watching Maris feed Coralie while Thane supervised from his usual protective position. "Jennifer told me about the echocardiogram results. And the cost. I've got it covered," Maris said quickly. "That's not what I'm worried about." Kellen crouched down beside the cage and Thane remarkably didn't hiss. "I'm worried about you. You've been here 3 weeks and you've already sacrificed more than some people do in years of working with animals." "It doesn't feel like sacrifice." "That's what worries me most." Kellen's expression was kind but concerned. "The cost isn't just financial. Emotional investment in shelter animals, especially ones with complicated medical issues, it can break you when things don't work out. And if I don't invest, if I keep myself distant and safe, then you survive longer in this field. But do you really survive if you're not actually living?" Maris looked at Thane, at Coralie tucked against his warm body. "My father died doing what he loved, covered in grease, probably cursing at some stubborn bolt, completely in his element. Would I rather he'd worked a safe desk job and lived longer? Maybe. But he wouldn't have been who he was. That's different, is it? We're all choosing how much of ourselves to risk on things that matter. I'm choosing to risk everything on them. Maybe it'll break me, but maybe—" She paused, finding words for something she'd felt but not articulated until now. "Maybe being broken open is how we make room for more light." Kellen was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a check. "This is from my personal account. Not much, just $500. But it's toward Coralie's surgery. And before you argue, consider it payment for what you've taught me about why we do this impossible work." Maris felt her throat tighten. "Kellen, Jennifer's putting together a fundraiser. Some of the volunteers are contributing. We're going to help carry this load because that's what we do. We show up for each other, and for the animals who need us most." After he left, Maris sat in the quiet back room with tears streaming down her face. Thane made a soft, questioning sound, and she reached into the cage, running her fingers along his spine. "We're not alone," she told him. "That's what I keep learning. We think we have to do everything by ourselves, carry every burden alone. But we don't. There are people who show up. There are people who help." 3 days later, Dr. Hammond called. They'd had a cancellation. Could they bring Coralie in tomorrow for surgery? Tomorrow. Suddenly, everything accelerated from waiting to happening. Maris called Jennifer, called Kellen, called her aunt. She prepared supplies, updated her notes, checked and rechecked Coralie's vital signs. The tiny calico, oblivious to what was coming, played with a small toy mouse that one of the volunteers had brought, batting it with paws that were growing more coordinated every day. Thane seemed to sense something was different. He was more alert, more protective, following Coralie's every movement with laser focus. When Maris tried to separate them briefly to do Coralie's final pre-surgery checkup, his protest was immediate and vocal. "I know," Maris said, keeping her movements slow and calm. "Big day tomorrow, scary day but necessary day." She spent the night at the shelter, sleeping on a cot in the back room, keeping watch over them both. Every few hours she'd check Coralie's breathing, her heart rate, her color. Every few hours she'd whisper to Thane, reminding him they were in this together, that whatever happened, they'd face it as a team. In the darkest hours before dawn, when the shelter was utterly silent, Maris found herself talking to her father. She'd never been religious, had never believed in ghosts or spirits or an afterlife that made logical sense, but she talked to him anyway, because grief made space for impossible things. "I'm selling the shop," she said to the darkness. "Your shop, the place you spent 40 years building, and I'm using the money to save a cat and a kitten that I've known for less than a month. You'd probably think I'm crazy." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. Her father had been the man who'd spent 3 hours rescuing a kitten from a storm drain, who'd given free oil changes to customers who couldn't pay, who'd always said that character was measured by how you treated beings who couldn't do anything for you in return. "Or maybe you'd understand," she whispered. "Maybe you'd say I'm doing exactly what you taught me, showing up, helping when it's hard, refusing to walk away just because it's complicated." At dawn, Jennifer arrived to help with transport. The surgery was scheduled for 9 a.m., and they needed to be in Burlington by 8:30. Getting Thane and Coralie into the carrier was easier this time. Thane was learning that the carrier meant going together, and going together was the only thing that mattered. Dr. Hammond was waiting when they arrived, her team already prepped and ready. "How's our patient?" "Stable," Maris reported. "Heart rate elevated but within expected parameters. No respiratory distress." "And her guardian?" Maris looked at Thane pressed against Coralie in the carrier, his eyes bright with anxiety. "Terrified, but trusting me, I think." "That's all we can ask." Dr. Hammond's expression grew serious. "Maris, I need to be clear about expectations. This surgery has good odds, but it's not without risk. Kittens this young, with hearts this compromised, complications can happen. Anesthesia complications, bleeding, infection, cardiac arrest. We'll do everything possible, but I need you to understand that everything possible might not be enough." "I understand." "Do you? Because I've seen people invest everything in an outcome, and when it doesn't go the way they hoped." "I understand that she might die," Maris said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "I understand that Thane kept her alive for weeks against impossible odds, and that all of this might still end with losing her. But I also understand that doing nothing definitely means losing her. So we do something, we try, we fight, and if we lose anyway, at least we'll know we did everything we could." Dr. Hammond nodded slowly. "All right then, let's save a kitten." Separating Coralie from Thane was as traumatic as Maris had feared. "The moment, Doctor." Hammond's technician reached into the carrier, Thane exploded into action, hissing, scratching, trying to position himself between the reaching hands and Coralie's small body. It took 3 people to safely remove Coralie, and the sound Thane made when they succeeded was something Maris would never forget. It wasn't anger, it was grief, immediate and absolute. The sound of someone watching their whole world disappear. "Sedate him," Dr. Hammond ordered. "Now." That level of distress isn't good for either of them. The injection worked quickly, and Thane's frantic struggling slowed, stopped. His eyes found Maris's face as consciousness slipped away, and in that moment she saw accusation, fear, a desperate plea to make this stop. "I'm sorry," she whispered, cradling his limp body. "I'm so sorry, but this is how we save her. Trust me. Please, trust me." The surgery took 4 hours. Maris and Jennifer waited in the clinic's family room, a space designed for people to fall apart in private. Other clients came and went, collecting healthy pets, dropping off animals for routine procedures. The normalcy of their visits felt surreal against the magnitude of what was happening in the operating room. At hour 2, Maris started drafting the crowdfunding campaign she'd been planning, needing something to occupy her hands and mind. She wrote about Thane and Coralie, about impossible love and desperate chances. She wrote about how sometimes the bravest thing we can do is refuse to accept that some battles are too big to fight. At hour 3, Jennifer went for coffee, came back with food neither of them could eat. "She's going to be okay," Jennifer said, though her voice lacked conviction. "She has to be, after everything." "The universe doesn't work that way," Maris said. "Bad things happen to beings who don't deserve them. Good efforts end in tragedy. There's no cosmic justice that rewards suffering with happy endings. Then why do this? Why risk everything on an outcome you can't control?" Maris thought about her father, about finding him on that concrete floor, about the helplessness of being seconds too late, because sometimes risk is all we have. Sometimes showing up and trying is the only thing that separates us from giving up entirely. At hour 4, Dr. Hammond emerged from the surgical area. Her scrubs were splattered with blood, her expression unreadable. Maris stood up so quickly the world tilted. "She made it," Dr. Hammond said, and Maris's knees nearly gave out. "The surgery went well. We closed the ductus, and her heart is already showing improved function. The next 72 hours will be critical. She'll need intensive monitoring and there's still risk of complications, but she survived the surgery itself, which was the biggest hurdle. Can I see her?" "Not yet. She's in recovery, still intubated, but..." Dr. Hammond paused, a small smile breaking through her professional mask. "You can see this." She pulled out her phone, showed them a photo. Coralie, tiny and fragile, with a breathing tube and IV lines and monitors, but alive. Her chest rising and falling, her heart, newly repaired, beating with purpose. Maris pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the sob building in her chest. Jennifer, standing beside her, wasn't as successful. She openly wept, not bothering to hide it. "When can we take her back to Thane?" Maris managed to ask. 24 hours minimum, possibly 48. She needs to be stable, needs to come off the ventilator successfully. And honestly, she needs to be strong enough to handle his reaction. He's going to want to examine her, lick her, potentially be too enthusiastic in his relief. "He'll be gentle," Maris said with certainty. He's always been gentle with her. They brought Thane out of sedation without Coralie, and it was as bad as Maris had feared. The moment he woke up and registered her absence, he panicked. He searched the carrier frantically, crying in that heartbreaking way, looking to Maris with eyes that asked why she'd broken her promise, why she'd let them take Coralie away. "She's okay," Maris said, opening the carrier, letting him out into the private room Dr. Hammond had provided. "The surgery worked, Thane. Her heart is fixed, she's alive, and she's going to be okay." But Thane didn't understand words. He only understood that Coralie was gone, that the kitten he'd protected with every fiber of his being was somewhere he couldn't reach. He paced the room in agitated circles, crying continuously, pausing only to press his face against Maris's hands, seeking some confirmation that his world hadn't ended. "Tomorrow," Maris promised, letting him sniff her thoroughly. She smelled like the clinic, like antiseptic and stress, but maybe she also smelled like Coralie. "Tomorrow we'll see her, and in a day or two, she'll be strong enough to come home. Back to your cage, back to your blanket, back to you." She spent the night in the clinic's family room with Thane, neither of them sleeping much. He was too agitated, too desperate for confirmation that Coralie existed somewhere. Maris was too wired on adrenaline and hope and terror that something would go wrong in these critical hours, that they'd come so far only to lose everything at the last moment. But morning came, and Coralie was stable. Her vitals were strong. She'd come off the ventilator and was breathing on her own. When Dr. Hammond let Maris see her, the tiny calico was awake, though clearly uncomfortable, her small body overwhelmed by the trauma of surgery, but alive. Impossibly, miraculously alive. "Can Thane see her?" Maris asked. "Just for a minute, he's suffering without her." Dr. Hammond hesitated. "It's unconventional. We don't usually allow animals in the ICU. Nothing about this situation is conventional." After a long moment, Dr. Hammond nodded. 5 minutes, supervised. If he gets too excited or rough, we remove him immediately." They brought Thane into the ICU on a leash. Another first, another strange necessity of this impossible situation. His reaction to seeing Coralie was immediate and overwhelming. He tried to surge forward, stopped only by Maris's gentle restraint. He cried, a sound of pure relief and desperate love. "Gentle," Maris said firmly. "She's hurting, Thane. You have to be so gentle." Dr. Hammond lifted him carefully, positioned him next to Coralie's recovery crate. The moment Thane caught Coralie's scent fully, his frantic energy transformed. He became utterly still, his movements turning slow and deliberate. He sniffed her carefully, starting at her head, working down her small body. When he reached the surgical site covered by a tiny bandage, he paused, his whiskers twitching as he processed the unfamiliar smell of adhesive and medicine. Then, with heartbreaking tenderness, he began to groom her. His tongue moved in careful strokes over her head, her ears, her paws, the same grooming he'd done when he'd first found her in the storm, when she'd been wet and cold and close to death. The grooming that said, "You're mine. I've got you. You're safe." Coralie, despite her obvious discomfort, began to purr. The sound was weak but present, and it transformed Thane completely. His body relaxed. His crying stopped. He curled himself as close to her as the crate allowed, his nose pressed against the mesh separating them, his purr rising to meet hers. "Okay," Dr. Hammond said, her voice thick with emotion. That's the best medicine she could possibly have right now. They allowed Thane to stay beside Coralie's crate for 30 minutes, monitoring both of them carefully. His presence seemed to calm her, and her presence calmed him. When they finally had to separate them again, Thane went more peacefully, seeming to understand now that she was alive, that this separation was temporary, that the humans were helping rather than hurting. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of careful monitoring and incremental improvements. Coralie grew stronger each day, eating small amounts, tolerating movement better, showing the resilience that had kept her alive through everything else. Dr. Hammond was cautiously optimistic, though she warned repeatedly about the risk of complications, about the long recovery ahead. On the morning of the third day, she cleared Coralie for discharge. She's ready to go home. Well, as ready as she can be. She'll need medication twice daily, careful monitoring, no rough play, restricted activity. And she'll need follow-up appointments to ensure the repair holds as she grows. "We can do that," Maris said without hesitation. "You'll need to keep her calm. That's going to be the biggest challenge. Kittens don't understand they need to rest. She'll want to play, to explore, to do all the things healthy kittens do. Thane will help. He's been careful with her from the beginning." Dr. Hammond smiled. "You know, in 20 years of veterinary cardiology, I've never seen anything quite like this. The male cat who saved an infant, who sacrificed his own health to keep her alive, who's showing more parental instinct than some actual mothers. If you write that crowdfunding campaign, people need to hear this story. It's extraordinary." The reunion at the shelter was everything Maris had hoped for. When she placed Coralie back in Thane's cage, now outfitted with even more comfortable bedding and careful barriers to keep her from overexerting herself, his joy was palpable. He checked her over completely, sniffing every inch, satisfying himself that she was whole and real and back where she belonged, Then he curled around her with a purr so loud it vibrated through the metal cage, and Coralie, exhausted from the journey home, fell asleep against his warmth with a contentment that spoke of safety and love and home. Kellen, Jennifer, and several volunteers gathered in the back room, watching the reunion with unabashed tears. "This is why we do it," Kellen said quietly. "All the heartbreak, all the impossible decisions, all the animals we can't save. This is why we keep showing up." For moments like this, Maris felt the weight of the past weeks settling over her, the emotional exhaustion, the financial strain, the constant fear and hope warring in her chest. But she also felt something else: purpose, connection, the sense that she'd done something that mattered, that her choices had saved lives that the world would have otherwise overlooked. "The crowdfunding campaign goes live tonight," Jennifer announced. "I've already been promoting it on the shelter's social media. The response has been incredible. We might actually pull this off," Maris said, allowing herself to hope. "We might actually save them both." "You already did save them," Kellen corrected. "Everything from here is just making sure they have the chance to live the life you gave back to them." That night, Maris launched the crowdfunding campaign, posting it across every platform she could access. She told Thane and Coralie's story with brutal honesty: the weeks of hiding, the desperate protection, the medical crisis, the surgery, the costs still mounting. She included photos: Thane's fierce green eyes, Coralie tucked against his orange and white fur, the surgical scar on her tiny chest. "This is a story about love," she wrote in the campaign description, "about a cat who refused to let a kitten die, even when the world gave them no chance. About the extraordinary lengths we go to protect the beings we love. About how sometimes hope requires not just belief, but action. Messy, expensive, terrifying action that might fail, but is worth attempting anyway." She set the goal at $10,000, enough to cover Coralie's surgery, medication, and follow-up care, with enough left over to help other shelter animals with expensive medical needs. It felt impossibly high, a number that would require hundreds of people to care about two animals they'd never met. The campaign went viral within 6 hours. By the next morning, they'd raised $15,000. By evening, $25,000. Messages poured in from around the world, people sharing their own stories of rescue animals, of impossible bonds, of love that refused to accept defeat. People who'd lost pets and found healing in helping Thane and Coralie. People who'd never owned animals, but were moved by the story of devotion against odds. "Look at this," Jennifer said, showing Maris her phone where the shelter's social media posts were being shared thousands of times. "People are calling Thane a hero. They're saying this is the most beautiful story they've heard all year." Maris looked at the cage where Thane slept with Coralie tucked safely against him, both of them peaceful in a way that seemed impossible just weeks ago. He is a hero. The truest kind. The kind who doesn't quit when things get hard. Who protects the vulnerable, who loves without reservation or calculation. Within a week, the crowdfunding campaign had raised $40,000. It was more than Maris had dreamed possible. More than enough to cover every expense, with substantial funds left over for the shelter's medical fund. Major news outlets started reaching out, wanting to feature the story. Animal welfare organizations called, asking to use Thane and Coralie's story in their fundraising efforts. But the best moment came 2 weeks post-surgery, when Coralie was cleared for gentle play. Maris introduced a small toy into their cage, watching as Coralie batted at it with increasing confidence. Her movements were still careful, still mindful of her healing chest, but there was joy in them. Pure, uncomplicated kitten joy. Thane watched her play with an expression that could only be described as pride. He'd occasionally join in, batting the toy back to her, but mostly he just supervised, his guardian duties still paramount, but now mixed with something lighter. Relief, maybe, or hope, or the beginning of understanding that they'd made it through the worst and were moving towards something better. "She's going to make it," Dr. Hammond confirmed during a follow-up visit, listening to Coralie's heart with her stethoscope. "The repair is holding perfectly. Her heart sounds normal, actually better than normal, strong and steady. And long-term prognosis? With medication and monitoring, she should live a normal life, normal lifespan, normal activity level once she's fully healed. You saved her, Maris. You and that remarkable orange cat saved her." But even as Coralie's health stabilized, another challenge loomed. The shelter's adoption program was ramping up for the holiday season, and Kellen was getting pressure from the board about space and resources. Thane and Coralie had been occupying their backroom cage for 2 months now, and while the crowdfunding campaign had relieved financial concerns, the physical space was still limited. "We need to think about their future," Kellen said one afternoon, his tone gentle but serious. "Long-term placement, adoption." The word hit Maris like cold water. Adoption. Of course they needed to be adopted. That was the whole point of a shelter, to find permanent homes for animals in need. But the thought of separating herself from Thane and Coralie, from these two beings she'd fought so hard to save, felt impossible. "They need to be adopted together," Maris said firmly. "Non-negotiable." "I agree, but that's a tough sell. Not many people want to take on a special needs kitten and her adult protector who has a history of aggression. He's not aggressive anymore. With you, he's not aggressive. With familiar staff, he's improving, but with strangers..." Kellen didn't finish the sentence. They both knew Thane was still unpredictable with unfamiliar people, still prone to defensive displays when he felt Coralie was threatened. "So we find someone who understands that, someone patient, someone willing to earn his trust, and willing to handle Coralie's medical needs. The twice-daily medication, the regular vet visits, the monitoring. Someone exists," Maris insisted, though doubt crept into her voice. "Someone perfect for them exists." That night, alone in her apartment, Maris faced the truth she'd been avoiding. She knew who was perfect for them. She knew who had the patience, the understanding, the commitment to give Thane and Coralie the home they deserved. The next morning, she walked into Kellen's office and said the words before she could change her mind. "I want to adopt them." Kellen looked up from his paperwork, unsurprised. "I was wondering when you'd realize that. Is it allowed for staff to adopt shelter animals?" "Technically, yes, though we usually discourage it because emotional attachment can cloud judgment. My judgment is perfectly clear. They need a home. I have a home. I'm already managing Coralie's medical care. Thane trusts me, it makes sense. It makes emotional sense, but Maris, you've already spent thousands on them, your father's shop, your savings, time and energy that went far beyond any job requirement. Are you sure you want to commit to years more of this?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Kellen studied her for a long moment, then smiled. "Then congratulations. You're about to become the owner of the world's most devoted cat and his special needs kitten." The adoption paperwork was finalized within a week. Maris prepared her apartment, cat-proofing every surface, setting up multiple cozy spaces, installing shelves and climbing structures that would keep them entertained but safe. She bought the best food, the softest beds, toys that ranged from practical to ridiculous, but the biggest preparation was emotional. She called her aunt, telling her about the decision, expecting judgment about taking on more responsibility when she was still processing grief and financial strain. Instead, her aunt laughed. "Your father had 7 cats when he was your age. Drive your mother absolutely crazy. He'd find them in alleys, behind dumpsters, hiding under cars, bring them home one after another, promising each time it was the last one. She'd threatened to leave him, but she never did because she loved that he couldn't walk past something that needed help." "I didn't know that," Maris said quietly. "You were too young when the last one passed, but he was that kind of man. The kind who couldn't ignore suffering just because it was inconvenient. Sounds like you're the same kind of person." The day Maris brought Thane and Coralie home was unseasonably warm for late December, one of those strange winter days when the sun felt like promise. She'd borrowed a large carrier again, lined it with their familiar blankets, filled it with their familiar scents. Thane was nervous about the change, his body tense, but when Maris kept talking to him, reminding him they were together, that she wouldn't separate them, he gradually relaxed. Her apartment was small, 1 bedroom, a living room that doubled as everything else, a kitchen barely big enough for 1 person. But she'd made it ready. Cat trees by the windows, beds in sunny spots, dishes waiting to be filled, a home waiting to become theirs. When she opened the carrier in her living room, Thane emerged cautiously, his nose working overtime to process the new environment. Coralie, bolder now that her health had stabilized, tumbled out after him, already eager to explore. For several minutes they moved through the space together, Thane checking each room for threats while Coralie discovered toys and cozy corners with kitten enthusiasm. Then Thane returned to where Maris sat on the floor, watching them. He looked at her with those green eyes that had once held only distrust and now held something else. Recognition, maybe. Gratitude. The beginning of something that looked like love. He butted his head against her hand, purring, and Coralie, seeing this interaction, scrambled over to join in. Soon Maris was surrounded by orange and white and calico fur, by purrs that filled the small apartment with warmth, by the physical proof that impossible things sometimes happened anyway. "Welcome home," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "Welcome home, both of you." That night, as she lay in bed with Thane curled against her legs and Coralie sleeping on her chest, Maris thought about the journey that had brought them here. 2 months ago, she'd been a new employee at a shelter, carrying grief she didn't know how to process, walking through life without purpose or direction. Now she was responsible for 2 lives that depended on her, financially stretched beyond reasonable limits, emotionally invested in a way that probably wasn't sustainable. But she was also more alive than she'd felt since finding her father on that concrete floor. She had purpose. She had connection. She had proof that showing up and fighting for the vulnerable could actually matter. Her phone buzzed with another notification. Someone else had donated to the crowdfunding campaign. Someone else had shared their story. The number was up to 55,000 now, enough to not only cover all of Thane and Coralie's expenses, but to establish a real medical fund at Meadowbrook to help other animals with expensive conditions get the care they needed. Maris looked at the sleeping cats, at Coralie's small chest rising and falling with the breath that had been so close to stopping forever, at Thane's protective position even in sleep. They'd all saved each other, she realized. Thane had saved Coralie. Maris had saved them both, and they'd saved her right back, giving her reason to keep going when grief had made the world feel colorless and purposeless. Her father's shop was sold now, the papers finalized just yesterday. Someone else would work in that space, would build their own dreams where her father had built his. But the money from that sale had gone towards saving lives, and somehow that felt like the right ending, or not ending, transformation. Taking something that represented loss and turning it into new life, new chances, new beginnings. Outside her apartment window, snow had started to fall. December, finally remembering it was winter. The world looked clean and possible, covered in white that hid old scars and made everything feel new. Coralie stirred against Maris's chest, her tiny paw flexing in sleep, and Thane's purr deepened, a rumble of contentment that spoke of safety earned through struggle. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, medication schedules, vet appointments, the ongoing work of building trust and maintaining health. But tomorrow was still hours away. For now, there was warmth and the sound of breathing and the simple miracle of beings who'd survived against impossible odds, finally safe in a place they could call home. Maris closed her eyes, feeling sleep pull at her consciousness. Her last thought before drifting off was that maybe this was what healing looked like. Not the absence of pain or loss, but the presence of new love. Not forgetting what you'd lost, but honoring it by saving what you could. Not being unbroken, but being broken open enough to let light in. In the morning, she would wake to Coralie's demanding mews for breakfast and Thane's gentle headbutts for attention. She would administer medication and clean litter boxes and navigate the beautiful, complicated reality of caring for two beings who needed her. She would check the crowdfunding campaign and probably cry again at the messages from strangers who'd been moved by a story about love refusing to quit. But for now, in the darkness of her small apartment, with snow falling outside and two cats sleeping peacefully against her body, Maris simply existed in the moment, grateful, exhausted, overwhelmed, hopeful, alive in all the ways that mattered most. The winter months passed in a rhythm of routine and revelation. Coralie grew stronger each day, her small body filling out, her movements becoming more confident. The surgical scar on her chest faded to a thin line, barely visible beneath her calico fur. Her twice-daily medications became part of the morning and evening ritual, something she tolerated with increasing patience, especially when Thane would position himself nearby as moral support. Thane's transformation continued to unfold in layers. The aggressive, hissing cat from the shelter became increasingly gentle, his trust expanding beyond just Maris. When her aunt visited in January, Thane allowed the stranger to approach him, to stroke his orange and white fur. Though he kept himself positioned between the visitor and Coralie, old protective instincts never fully dormant. But it was the small moments that revealed the depth of change. Thane actually playing with feather toys, his movements awkward at first, as if he'd forgotten how to be a cat who wasn't in survival mode. Thane sitting in sunny windowsills, watching birds with the lazy fascination of a creature who felt safe enough to be distracted. Thane sleeping on his back, vulnerable and trusting. Something Maris had read was the ultimate sign of feline contentment. Coralie, meanwhile, developed a personality that was pure joy, wrapped in calico fur. She was fearless in the way only beings who'd survived the unsurvivable could be, approaching each day like an adventure waiting to happen. She climbed things she shouldn't, squeezed into spaces too small for her growing body, and treated every object in the apartment as a potential toy. But she was also tender with Thane, seeming to understand on some instinctive level that he was special, that he'd saved her, that she owed him everything. She'd groom his ears when he was tired, curl up against him when he seemed anxious, share her food even though he had his own. The bond between them was something beyond typical feline relationships. It was family, chosen and fought for, and absolutely unbreakable. Maris documented their progress on the crowdfunding campaign page, posting photos and updates that continued to move people around the world. Each post generated dozens of comments, messages from people who saw their own struggles reflected in Thane and Coralie's story, cancer survivors who related to Coralie's medical journey, people who'd lost everything and rebuilt who saw themselves in Thane's transformation. Anyone who'd ever loved something enough to fight impossible odds. The money kept coming in, eventually reaching $70,000. The shelter used the funds to establish the Thane and Coralie Medical Fund, dedicated to helping animals with expensive medical conditions that would otherwise prevent their adoption. In the first month alone, the fund helped 3 dogs with hip dysplasia, 2 cats with diabetes, and a rabbit with dental disease. "You've changed everything," Kellen told Maris during a visit to her apartment, watching Thane and Coralie play together. "Not just for these two, but for every animal that comes through our doors. People are more willing to take chances on special needs cases now because they've seen that love and medicine can work miracles." "It wasn't a miracle," Maris corrected. "It was work. Exhausting, expensive, terrifying work, but work that mattered. That's the real miracle. People willing to do the work." In March, Dr. Hammond called with news from Coralie's latest echocardiogram. Her heart looks perfect. The repair has held beautifully, and she's showing no signs of cardiac compromise. Based on what I'm seeing, she should live a completely normal life. Maris felt tears sting her eyes. Normal. That's such a beautiful word. It is, especially when you consider where she started. A kitten found in a storm, malnourished and dying with a heart defect that should have killed her before she was 3 months old. Now she's 6 months old and thriving. That's not medical science alone. That's love doing what love does best, refusing to accept defeat. Maris looked at Coralie, who was currently attempting to climb the refrigerator by using Thane as a launching pad, her kitten energy apparently unlimited. Can we reduce her medications? Eventually, yes, we'll taper slowly over the next few months, monitor closely, but I'm optimistic that by her first birthday, she might not need daily medication at all. After the call, Maris sat on her couch with Thane curled beside her, Coralie finally exhausted from her climbing attempts and sleeping in a patch of March sunlight. She thought about the journey from that November afternoon when she'd discovered them in the shelter to this moment, about all the terror and hope and impossible choices in between. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Remember that family from Bridgeport, the ones who came to the shelter looking for a calm adult cat? They just sent photos. They adopted the diabetic tabby from the medical fund. Said, if Thane could fight for Coralie, they could handle twice daily insulin shots. Maris smiled, understanding now how ripples worked. One story of refusing to quit inspired others to take chances, to show up, to believe that difficult didn't mean impossible. Thane and Coralie's story wasn't just about them. It was about what became possible when people decided that love was worth the cost. Spring arrived in Vermont with dramatic suddenness, winter releasing its grip in a rush of melting snow and emerging green. Maris opened her apartment windows, letting in air that smelled like possibility and new growth. Thane discovered the joy of screen watching, sitting at the open window with his nose pressed against the mesh, tracking birds and insects with predatory fascination tempered by absolute safety. Coralie discovered the joy of spring-scented breezes, her small face pointed into the wind, whiskers twitching with all the new smells. She'd grown into a beautiful young cat now, her calico pattern more defined, her body long and lean and healthy. The only reminder of her difficult start was that thin scar on her chest and the way Thane still automatically positioned himself protectively when she slept. In April, Maris received an unexpected call. A production company wanted to make a short documentary about Thane and Coralie's story, to be featured in a series about extraordinary animal rescues. The exposure would help the shelter, would inspire more donations to the medical fund, would spread the message that special needs animals deserved chances. But it also meant cameras in her apartment, strangers asking questions, reliving the terror and uncertainty of those early weeks. Maris hesitated, torn between privacy and the potential good the exposure could do. She sat on her living room floor with Thane and Coralie, explaining the situation as if they could understand. People want to hear about you two, about how Thane saved you, Coralie, about how love fought impossible odds and won, but it means letting strangers into our space, into our story. Thane looked at her with those green eyes that had seen so much hardship and transformation. He butted his head against her hand, purring, a gesture that had become his way of saying everything would be okay. Coralie, meanwhile, attacked Maris's shoelaces, because some things were more important than human drama. Okay, Maris said, making the decision. We'll do it. Because if our story helps even one person decide to take a chance on a special needs animal, it'll be worth it. The documentary filming happened over 2 weeks in May, the crew working carefully to minimize disruption and stress. They filmed Thane and Coralie's daily routine, the medication times, the play sessions, the moments of pure contentment when they slept curled together in pools of sunlight. They interviewed Maris, Kellen, Jennifer, Dr. Hammond, even Soren, the traveling veterinarian who'd first examined Coralie. But the most powerful footage came from simply watching Thane and Coralie interact. The way Thane still groomed Coralie multiple times a day, the same meticulous attention he'd given her when she was dying in his cage, the way Coralie sought him out when she was tired or uncertain, pressing her face against his orange and white fur, the way they moved through the apartment in unconscious coordination, always aware of each other's location, always connected. This is what love looks like, the documentary's director said, watching the footage. Not the Hollywood version or the greeting card version. The real thing, messy and complicated and absolutely unbreakable. The documentary aired in July, during the height of summer when people were looking for feel-good stories. It went viral immediately, generating millions of views in the first week. News outlets picked it up, social media exploded with shares and comments, and the shelter's phone started ringing constantly with people wanting to adopt special needs animals, inspired by what they'd seen. The crowdfunding campaign received another surge of donations, pushing the total past $100,000. The medical fund could now help dozens of animals, could cover expensive surgeries and treatments that would have otherwise meant death or permanent shelter residency. But more importantly, the story changed conversations. People started talking about the hidden heroes in their own lives, the shelter workers, the foster volunteers, the veterinarians who worked miracles on shoestring budgets. They talked about second chances and impossible odds, and refusing to give up on beings the world had overlooked. Maris received hundreds of messages from people sharing their own stories of rescue and transformation. A woman whose chronically ill cat had lived 10 years past its prognosis. A man who'd adopted a 3-legged dog everyone said was unadoptable. A teenager who'd saved their allowance for months to pay for a rabbit's dental surgery. Stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things because love demanded it. "We touched something," Jennifer said during one of her regular visits, watching the messages pour in. "Something deeper than just a cute animal story. We reminded people that kindness matters, that showing up matters, that fighting for the vulnerable changes the world." Thane reminded people. Maris corrected. "I just paid the bills. You did more than that. You saw what everyone else missed. You refused to accept that some fights were too big. You taught us all that sometimes the most radical thing we can do is refuse to walk away from something just because it's difficult." In August, Coralie had her final cardiac checkup before her first birthday. Dr. Hammond ran every test, examined every aspect of her heart function, then smiled with genuine joy. "She's perfect, completely, absolutely perfect. No medication needed, no restrictions on activity. She's just a normal, healthy young cat now. Because of the surgery." Because of the surgery, yes, but also because someone kept her alive long enough to get that surgery. Because a cat who'd lost everything decided she was worth saving. Because you decided both of them were worth saving. Dr. Hammond paused, her expression thoughtful. "You know what the real miracle is? Not the successful surgery or the recovered heart. It's that a traumatized stray cat could still access that much love, that much devotion, when the world had given him every reason to become hard and cruel. That's what restores my faith in the universe, that even after terrible suffering, beings can still choose love." Maris thought about that often in the months that followed, about how Thane could have become vicious, could have focused only on survival, could have ignored a dying kitten because helping her put him at risk. But he hadn't. He'd chosen love even when love meant sacrifice and danger and the possibility of devastating loss. Maybe that was the real lesson, not that love guaranteed happy endings, but that choosing love was worthwhile regardless of outcome, that showing up and fighting and refusing to quit was its own form of victory, separate from whether we won or lost the specific battle. Coralie's first birthday in October was celebrated with special treats and new toys, and a party that included half the shelter staff. She was fully grown now, a beautiful calico with bright eyes and endless energy, and a scar on her chest that told a story about survival and second chances. She played with abandon, secure in the knowledge that Thane was nearby, that Maris was watching, that she was safe and loved and home. Thane, now almost 4 years old based on veterinary estimates, had become a different cat entirely from the aggressive, hissing creature in that back shelter cage. He was calm, affectionate, playful when the mood struck. He greeted visitors with cautious interest instead of hostility. He'd learned that not all hands were threats, not all changes were losses, not all strangers were dangers, but he remained devoted to Coralie above all else. That bond, forged in desperation and maintained through crisis, was the foundation of his transformation. She was his purpose, his anchor, his proof that love could survive even when everything else was lost. They saved each other, Kellen observed at the party, watching Thane and Coralie play together. He saved her life, but she saved his soul. She gave him a reason to trust again, to hope again, to believe that good things could happen. Maris nodded. understanding now what she hadn't fully grasped in those early terrifying weeks. Saving Thane and Coralie had never been just about them. It had been about fighting back against all the cruelty and indifference in the world, about proving that individual actions mattered, that showing up for the vulnerable changed outcomes. It had been about learning that broken things could heal, that traumatized beings could learn to trust, that love, patient, persistent, refusing to quit love, was the most powerful force in the universe. As autumn deepened and then gave way to winter again, Maris marked the anniversary of that November day when she'd found them in the shelter. 1 year since everything had changed. 1 year of transformation and growth, and building a life none of them could have imagined in those desperate early days. She thought about her father often, about the shop she'd sold to save them, about whether he would have understood her choices. But she knew the answer. He'd spent his life helping beings who couldn't help themselves, showing up for the overlooked and forgotten. He would have understood completely. More than that, he would have been proud. On the anniversary evening, Maris sat on her couch with Thane on one side and Coralie on the other, both cats purring in contentment. The apartment was warm, the winter wind outside making their safety feel even more precious. The medical fund had helped 47 animals in its first year. The documentary had inspired dozens of similar stories around the world. And 2 cats who should have died had instead lived, thrived, became symbols of what was possible when people refused to accept that some battles couldn't be won. "Thank you," Maris whispered to them both, though she wasn't sure exactly what she was thanking them for surviving, for fighting, for teaching her that love was worth any cost, that broken things could heal, that second chances were real if you were willing to work for them. Thane looked at her with those green eyes that had once held only distrust and now held something infinitely softer. Coralie, already half asleep, kneaded Maris's leg with her paws, that instinctive gesture of contentment that cats never fully outgrew. Outside, snow had started to fall again, December repeating itself. But inside, in this small apartment that had become home, there was only warmth and safety, and the simple miracle of beings who'd survived impossible odds, finally at peace. The story could have ended differently. Thane could have died defending a kitten no one knew existed. Coralie could have succumbed to her heart condition before help arrived. Maris could have walked away, decided it was too complicated, too expensive, too emotionally risky. Any of those outcomes would have been understandable, even reasonable. But they'd chosen differently. They'd chosen to fight, to risk, to show up, even when the odds screamed that effort was futile. And that choice, repeated every day, through every challenge, in every moment when quitting would have been easier, had made all the difference. It wasn't a fairy tale. There had been no magic, no divine intervention, no guarantee of success. Just beings who loved each other, choosing over and over to try, to persist, to refuse to accept defeat. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that was enough. Sometimes love, patient and persistent, and absolutely refusing to quit, was enough to change everything. Maris closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 2 cats against her body, hearing the symphony of their purrs filling the small space. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new medications to administer, new vet appointments to schedule, new costs to manage. But tomorrow was still hours away. For now there was only this: warmth and breathing, and the profound peace that came from knowing she'd shown up, she'd fought. She'd refused to walk away when walking away would have been easier. She'd saved 2 lives, and in the process, they'd saved her right back. Outside, the snow fell steadily, covering the world in white, making everything look new and possible. Inside, 3 beings who'd all survived their own versions of impossible breathed in synchrony, safe and warm and home. The journey from that November afternoon to this December evening had been long and difficult and expensive in ways that weren't just financial. But looking at Thane and Coralie, healthy, happy, alive, Maris knew with absolute certainty she'd do it all again. The fear, the cost, the endless worry, all of it. Because this was what mattered. Not the money or the recognition or even the documentary that had inspired thousands. This quiet moment of contentment, this proof that love could survive trauma, this evidence that fighting for the vulnerable changed outcomes. This was everything, and it was more than enough.